I think it's very cool how you guys can continue each other. Like, it's awesome. Hold on.
Land?
Hold on.
Oh, the dog. He's really cute. I mean,
Oh, no,
as far as pets go, he's cute.
He's the most adorable thing in the world.
Yeah, I'm not saying that he's not.
You just don't do pets.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, welcome to Wine with Adam. I'm your host, Adam Scott Bellos. Today, we are filming for the very first time in Neve Tzedek at the new headquarters of the Israel Innovation Fund, and I am joined by two very, very special people today. My guests are former Member of Parliament, roving unofficial ambassador of the State of Israel, Mom, Einat Wilf. Like, did I miss anything? Mother, wife, you got, you're good. Adi Schwartz, journalist for Haaretz, formerly. You've written on a number of different high-profile topics in Israel, but you're here together today to talk about your new book, The War of Return. So first question that I have to ask you guys before we even get into anything is, I haven't had you sign my book yet. Would you guys mind?
Please.
Thank you so much. So today we are going to be drinking a 2018 Bravdo Family Vineyard Cabernet Sauvignon. And this winery produces under 100,000 bottles. It's still a boutique winery. And I would say this is definitely one of the most interesting estate wineries in Israel. And they make unbelievable wine. So let me know what you guys think. Okay, so tell me what you taste, smell, l'chaim.
Chaim.
So happy to have both of you here today.
Happy to be here.
Wow, that's a fantastic smell.
Tastes good?
It's good, yeah?
It's very nice.
I go with dark cherries
Yeah.
on that one, yeah? What do you guys think?
It's great.
It's great. There you go, l'chaim to that. So we're here to talk about your book, The War of Return, how Western indulgence and the Palestinian dream has obstructed the path to peace. The right of return and the idea of the right of return has been something that has been embedded in the national consciousness of the Palestinian people, you could say since 1948. What is the right of return? Why is it so important, and what makes it such an obstacle to peace?
So first we'll start by saying that in the book we make it very clear that the right of return is neither a right, so it's not an internationally sanctioned right, and by now it's certainly not a return. But just to know what it means from the Palestinian perspective, they believe that the Arabs who either fled in the course of 1948 war or were expelled in the course of war, and by now there are millions of descendants, possess, in their view, a right that supersedes Israeli sovereignty to settle inside the State of Israel. The numbers are such, of course, that the exercise of this so-called right would mean the transformation of the State of Israel into an Arab majority state with a Jewish minority. So that's what it means from the Arab perspective. The right of return was basically conceived at the end of the War of 1948, a war that was fought by the Arab side in order to prevent the establishment of the State of Israel in any borders. And the way that the Arabs thought about the war once the war was over is that the war is not over, that perhaps they may have lost this battle, the State of Israel is established, it's independent, but the war is not over. And there were various mechanisms by which they planned to continue the war. The most obvious was to continue having war, terrorism, economic boycotts. And one of the main mechanisms established at the time was the idea of using the hundreds of thousands of Arab refugees from the war as a means of continuing the war. So rather than operate according to international norms of settling refugees in the places to which they fled or finding somewhere else, the idea was to keep them in perpetual limbo until such time that they could undo the war, take back Israel, and turn it into an Arab majority state. And one of the things we show in the book is how the entire Palestinian collective identity and consciousness have coalesced around this idea of return.
Interesting. So what I'm a little confused about, though, is that in 1948, there was a war, and within a 2-year period, almost 1 million Jews, if not 750,000 Jews, were exiled from all of the different Arab countries, and they were assimilated and absorbed. So how are we in this situation now with them, given that we don't have Jewish refugees?
So the reason is political. The Jews who came from Iraq, Syria, all the Arab countries wanted to be part of this country. They did not want to continue having an open battle, an open conflict with the Arab countries. The refugee issue was never a humanitarian issue or an economic issue. It was never about not having enough money to resettle them or that nobody wanted to resettle them. That's not the question. You cannot resettle people who do not want to be resettled.
Interesting. We started with 750,000 refugees, and at the end of your book, I think you quoted it at about 5 million?
5.6.
5.6, okay, which is the only refugee group that has ever grown in their numbers, if I'm correct. Okay, so Einat, I want to ask you something. You guys spent a ton of time in the very beginning of the book. I mean, like the majority of the beginning of the book is really about two things. You go through all of the different population transfers that happened as a result of the end of World War II. And then you also spend a ton of time going through Israeli policy during the War of Independence. But a main thing that you guys really worked to get across is that this was not ethnic cleansing. Okay, and there are obviously, if you look at a lot of anti-Zionist propaganda, people say they were committing genocide against Palestinians. I mean, they obviously don't know what the term genocide means because it doesn't make sense because the population has grown. But explain to me, why did Israel not commit ethnic cleansing in 1948? Or how did it not commit ethnic cleansing in 1948?
So in the Hebrew version, for example, of the book, we didn't discuss a lot what happened in the war. It's understood. But we realized that especially in English-speaking audiences, the image by now is that 1948, that the War of 1948 looked like that. They were idyllic Palestinian farmers just sitting by, minding their own business, when all of a sudden, the Israeli Defense Forces, which already in 1948 existed in full force, already then had F-15, F-16s, and tanks, just entered into Palestine, which was a state of idyllic farmers, and kind of moved in with this superior, highly technological army and ethnically cleansed the poor Palestinian farmers and then established the state of Israel. So we had to bring back to people what the War of 1948 was. That it was, first of all, a war that involved Arabs and Jews, and Arabs as an active force, not as bystanders, as people who had clear aims, declared aims. The aims were to prevent the Jews from having sovereignty anywhere and in any borders, annihilationist aims, that they obviously comprised the dominant group in the region at a ratio of about 50-1, the number of Arabs compared to the number of Jews, and that it was a war of existence. And that the Jews at the same time were a ragtag also force with many refugees just coming from World War II, literally coming down from the boats to fight. And we show that it was all in the context of war. People do not remember what war is anymore, which is good. But we had to remind them what the 1948 was like, what it felt like, why people mostly fled when the war started. People fled when the war came close to them, and only towards the end of the war do you see expulsions when there is a need to take over some villages and you can't tell apart combatants from non-combatants. We made it very clear. We looked at the plans, including the famous Plan Dalet, Plan D, showing that they were all military plans. They were not about ethnicities of Jews or Arabs. They were all about who's hostile and who's not.
So there was no new State of Israel Israeli policy put in place that was to ethnically cleanse neighborhoods of any kind, even if they were surrounded by Jewish areas?
Absolutely not. And you actually have proof where villages that were not hostile and from which there were not hostilities of Arabs maintained. Abu Ghosh is there's a lot of villages that remained. The only question was of hostility during war. And it's very important to remind all the time, this is during war, which is why Adi also wanted to mention that Jews in Arab countries did not engage in war and did not engage in hostilities and were actually ethnically cleansed for being Jews, not for being combatant or hostiles in war.
What I thought was most interesting, okay, was that you basically made the argument that this war is different from all other wars because of the refugee situation. Because you listed Pakistan and India, Greece and Turkey, Tibet,
Germany,
Czechoslovakia, all of the different population transfers that had to happen. Why is this so different? That's what I think people are trying to ask themselves. Why are 70 years later 5 million people still considered refugees from a war that happened right after World War II?
First of all, it's not just about World War II. The entire 20th century is about the transition from empires to nation states. Nations are established, borders are established, people flee, there is war, there's refugees, they all got settled. So in that sense, not only is the War of 1948 not special, the fact that there were refugees created in that war is not special. So anyone who tries to answer the question of why are we still stuck after 70 years with a population of 5.5 million refugees, our answer is, it's not because of the war. There's nothing special about the war. It's not particularly brutal. There's nothing special about the War of 1948 that would yield an explanation. The only explanation is indeed with Jewish sovereignty, about the Arab rejection of Jewish sovereignty and their assessment, being the majority in the region, that they don't have to accept defeat. And that's the key issue. They don't want to accept that the War of 1948 is over and that they were defeated in their aims of preventing Israel from being established.
Okay, so I want to talk about the 1930s. You have the Peel Commission, where the very first idea of partitioning the land comes into effect. It's rejected by the Arabs, and I don't mean Palestinians, I mean the Arab collective as a whole. At the same time, the white papers are issued. It's really the beginning of the very first Intifada, the Arab Revolt from 36 to 39. How do all of these things, the rejectionism, the revolt, and the blocking off of Jewish immigration into Europe, how do they create the powder keg that became 48 that led to the refugee crisis?
For about 30 years, the battle against Jewish sovereignty focuses on immigration, preventing Jews from immigrating.
Can you repeat that?
Sure.
Say that again.
For about 30 years, the Arab battle against the establishment of Jewish sovereignty focuses on immigration.
So you're saying that Arab leadership was trying to prevent Jews fleeing extermination from seeking refuge in British Palestine?
Even before. We're talking even before 1939. We're talking in the 20s and the 30s. The Arab focus is on preventing Jews from immigrating.
Are you saying that the Arab leadership at the time was responsible for the death of millions of European Jews? Because it sounds like what you're saying is that Palestinian leadership prevented the escape of European Jewry from the Holocaust.
What I'm saying is that Arabs and Palestinian Arabs cannot wash their hands from some responsibility. Because in the region they outnumbered Jews, they were able to have sway with a lot of countries. And over time, they led to the closure of the land to Jewish immigration. If Arabs had not opposed Jewish sovereignty, Jews would have had a state in the late 20s, early 30s.
I've never heard that before.
Yes. The mandate system established by the League of Nations established countries like Iraq and Jordan and Lebanon and Syria, which became independent in the 30s, 20s, 30s. The same would have happened for the Jewish people in Israel had it not been for Arab rejection. And in that sense, the Arabs are not blameless for the fact that the Jews did not have a state at the most critical moment in Jewish history.
So if we go back to your first question of why is this happening, the question is why the bystanders, why the mediators, why the West, with its political power, with its money nowadays, why it chose to sustain and perpetuate this problem instead of doing what they did to the Germans in Germany after World War II. They also wanted to return. The Germans wanted to return to Czechoslovakia. We detailed that in the book. Everybody wants to return to their home. It's nice, I want to have my home back. But the world, the international community came to these people and told them, listen, you're not going back anywhere. That's it. We have new borders. Germans, you're going to be in Germany. You're going to be German citizens. You're not going back, because going back to Czechoslovakia would start the war again. This is exactly what we don't want to happen. This was a decision by Churchill, by Roosevelt, and then Truman. So it was an international consensus that you don't go back. This is the one thing that they didn't do in this case.
So let's talk about UNRWA. First, I'd like to know, what is the difference between the United Nations Relief Work Agency for Palestinians versus the United Nations High Commission for Refugees? Okay, what is the difference between UNRWA and the UNHCR? People don't understand that there are two different refugee organizations for all refugees and then just Palestinian refugees. Why is UNRWA so important, and what role does it play? What's the deal here?
UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, basically is established after the War of 1948 as a temporary agency. And it's still, after 70 years, more than 70 years, temporary. Now, it's a temporary agency to deal with the refugees of that war. Why is it temporary? Because the assumption is, give or take, it's going to take 3, 4, 5 years, some money, settle the refugees, do some big projects, and it's over. In the book, we tell of another such temporary agency, UNRWA, with K, for the Korean refugees. UNRWA does what it's supposed to do. Within a few short years, it settles 2 million refugees from North Korea. That's 3 times the numbers of the Arab refugees from the 1948 war. With less money than UNRWA, all of them are settled. Now, it's an interesting case of alternative history. The Palestinians themselves, they're not pawns, they're not tools by anyone, themselves refuse to be resettled. Not in Jordan, not in Syria, not in Lebanon, anywhere else. So together with the Arab countries who reject Jewish self-determination and reject the idea that the war of 1948 is over, pressure the West to keep UNRWA operational. The West wants to close UNRWA. They know it's a failure. No one's being settled. By keeping UNRWA open, you're at least giving the Arabs hope that the war of 1948 could be undone. And the West caves in and essentially pays protection. It's an annual bribe to the Arab world to keep the idea that the war of 1948 is not over, and therefore they will not be too angry that they were defeated in their aims of preventing Israel from being established. And this is the Western indulgence that kept UNRWA open as a temporary agency to the present day.
So basically, the organization still exists, and it's perpetuating the Palestinian refugee problem.
In the book, we introduce a word invented called Westsplaining.
Right.
Which, like mansplaining, is about this attitude of like, I know what you're really saying. It's when Westerners, when diplomats and journalists explain what Palestinians have just said. So a lot of Western diplomats that Adi and I have met genuinely believe that the Palestinians are not serious about return. They will say things, oh, they know it's an illusion, they're not serious about it, it's a bargaining chip. But when you talk to Palestinians, they're super serious, and from their perspective, it's not a delusion. They look at the region, they see their overwhelming numbers. Arabs outnumber Jews 50, 60 to 1. As far as they're concerned, all they need is patience. Another generation, another 5 generations, this Jewish experiment in sovereignty will go away. And the land will revert, in their view, to being as it should be, Arab.
What I don't understand, and I think what a lot of people don't understand, is you made a very simple argument, okay? The Palestinians have been basically political prisoners to Arab leadership's decisions.
No.
No, but let me, wait.
They've been political actors in themselves.
Actors, right, but I mean, like, I wouldn't necessarily say that Palestinians have been masters of their fate. in the last 70 years.
They have.
They, in many, much more than we think.
Explain to me why I'm incorrect on that then.
Because as I said before, from the beginning of the 50s, they were very vocal that they do not want to be resettled if the price of it is to acknowledge the state of Israel. Israel offered them compensation for the loss of property.
So are you saying that the Palestinian identity itself is a rejection of Jewish sovereignty?
Yes.
Exactly.
Okay. And what can you tell me about rebuilding Gaza and the obstacles that lay ahead of the rebuilding, and especially what UNRWA will do in terms of that role?
So Gaza is the perfect place to encapsulate the entire understanding of the conflict. When the Israeli military left Gaza in 2005, there was a lot of kind of saying, okay, we will now have an opportunity to make it into the Singapore of the Middle East. The Palestinians will finally have territory that they control where there is not a single Jewish settler, there is no military, they have a direct border with an Arab country, with Egypt, which Israel doesn't control. That's it. They're free to finally show us what they can do when they control their own territory. But in Gaza, about 2/3 to 3/4 of the people who live in Gaza are registered by UNRWA as refugees and view themselves, even though by now it's a 5th generation, as refugees from Palestine. Now they live in Gaza, it's not contested territory, it's Palestine. So if they were born in Palestine, how can they be refugees from Palestine? To them, the answer is very clear. They are interested far more in using Gaza as a launch pad from which to take back, in their view, their real home, Palestine, from the river to the sea. As long as UNRWA registers the majority of people in Gaza as refugees from Palestine, thereby indulging their dream that one day Palestine from the river to the sea will be theirs, no amount of money invested there will ever go towards a building of something that is permanent, that is Singapore of the Middle East.
Final question. I ask everybody this who comes on. I'm getting ready for my bar mitzvah. I'm 12 years old. If there's one thing that you could let me walk away with that would help me the rest of my life at 12, what is it?
I would say that being Jewish might not always be easy. At times it might be exhausting, but it will never be boring.
That's good. I like that one. Adi?
I don't have one right now, so it's weird.
L'chaim.
Yeah.
There you go.
I have a general advice for life, which is people think about you much less than you think.
Yeah.
That's good.
There you go. Thank you guys for joining me. I'm Adam Scott Bellos. This is Wine with Adam. I'm with Adi Schwartz and Einat Wilf, and I just want to say thank you to you both. Their book, The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace, is available on Amazon. You can find it there on Kindle and in hardback. And thank you so much for joining us. We're here in Tel Aviv. L'chaim.
L'chaim.
If you like the wine you saw on today's show, the 2018 Bravdo Cabernet Sauvignon, you can order it at wineonthevine.com. And if you want to plant a vine at the Bravdo Family Winery, go to wineonthevine.org. And remember, when you're drinking your Israeli wine, drink it with someone you love.